This is Ken Boa with Reflections Ministries. This is our Reflections podcast, and we are with my associate, Stuart McAllister.
Hello there, Dr. Boa. It's good to be back again.
It is always good to be with you.
So, Ken, last week we had an exotic look at some of the issues of vampires and vampirism with Glenn Sunshine. And obviously, one of the questions that keeps coming up this season, many people, Halloween, how does a Christian respond? How do people handle Halloween in light of its history? I think a lot of us don't even really understand the history, where it's come from. So you think Glenn would be willing to talk to us about that subject?
Glenn has been doing a lot of thinking about the origin. A lot of people wonder and don't really grasp how did Halloween come into being, and then how did it evolve into a growing cultural phenomenon as time has gone by. So Glenn would like to welcome your thoughts on the whole idea of the origin of Halloween itself and where we go from there.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Great to have you here. So tell us, Glenn. Yeah.
When we look at Halloween, what we actually, the term Halloween is a shortened version of All Hallows Eve. Hallows or holy is the holy ones. In other words, All Saints Day. So Halloween is the evening before All Saints. That's where the term comes from. Now, the history of that's kind of, it evolves over time, but it begins with the early church. People historically around the world feared death. With Jesus's resurrection, though, his followers didn't view death anything like the way the world around them did. This is why Christians had no fear of going into areas where there were epidemic diseases to minister to the sick, because they believed that if they died, they would just go on to a better life. This is why they faced martyrdom in the arenas so readily, that sort of thing. And the people who did this, the Christians who did this who died, were highly respected. And in fact, their deaths were commemorated by the church. So the churches would hold memorial services on the anniversaries of their deaths. This is when we have a saint's day, St. Patrick's Day or whatever. That's on the anniversary of their death, because on their death, that's when they entered heaven. So the problem is, we know the names of a number of saints. We know when they died. But what about all the ones that we don't know? The anonymous saints, the people whose deaths we, are not really recorded, or whose names are not recorded. So the church decided to create a feast of all saints. And this is occurring, by the early 600s. It's going to start. It'll start in May. It'll later shift ultimately to November 1st. This following a pattern set up actually by the Irish Church. And so it was known as the Feast of All Saints. In English, it was originally called Hallowmas. Hallow, again, being Holy One or Saint, Mass. So Hallowmas or All Hallows Day, which then turns to All Saints Day in more modern English. But the Hallows is preserved in Halloween, the evening before All Saints. So, in fact, Halloween began. It was the beginning of what ultimately will end up being a 3-day holiday in the church.
So, Glenn, can I interrupt you a second? Because
Sure.
Just only because I know that for many people, and I would say it's sort of several church traditions, with no background in some of these things, would see Halloween as being like a witches' fest or as a pagan festival. You're saying that that's not the source at all, that it was not, its roots are not in darkness, but rather in light.
Well, yes and no. It's a tad more complicated than that.
Great.
To sort of finish the story, they decided to add yet another feast day on November 2nd, the day after All Saints, to commemorate the souls that might be languishing in purgatory. So that's All Souls Day. They're people who are going to end up in heaven but aren't there yet. So you've got All Saints Day, November 1st, for the people who we believe are in heaven. You've got All Souls Day for the people who they believed were in purgatory but heading toward heaven. And then the day before all of this, you have the Halloween, the evening of All Hallows, like Christmas Eve. This is All Saints Eve. So this becomes a 3-day feast known in English as All Hallowtide. And it was an important feast in the medieval church. Now, as you said, Stuart, this is not the usual story you hear. What you usually hear is that the origins of Halloween are in Samhain, which is an ancient Celtic harvest festival typically celebrated around October 31st. And these festivities included going house to house in costume, asking for food, a lot like wassailing was done around Yuletide, around Christmas. The trick is Samhain. It looks like it should be pronounced Samhain, but it's actually pronounced Samhain. The trick is that within the Celtic calendar, the seasons began at the solstices and the equinoxes. And midway between them, they did not begin at the solstices and the equinoxes. They began midway between the solstices and the equinoxes. So spring would begin around February 1st. Summer would begin around May 1st. Fall would begin around autumn 1st. And winter would begin around November 1st. And what this meant is that the solstices and the equinoxes were halfway between these dates, roughly. And the reason for this is the Celts, now what you'll notice is that when I said winter begins somewhere around November 1st, October 31st is right there. That's when Samhain was celebrated. And the reason for that is the Celts believed that in these times, right midway between the solstice and the equinox, these were what they described as thin times. They're times when the visible and the invisible world touched more closely. Dawn and dusk are other in-between times or thin times where the supernatural and the physical world can interact more. And you have the holiday of Samhain, Beltane, and several others that are set up at these times as well. And particularly because you're going into winter, Samhain was frequently associated with ghosts, with the dead, and so on. And sometimes they would actually put food out for them. There are practices like this throughout the pagan world, not always on October 31st. There are other ones in like Lemuria and the Roman Empire was May 13th. So you have the connection between Halloween and Samhain is actually there. They did occur at the same time. And our modern approaches to Halloween, even though the holiday itself has its roots in Christianity, our modern practices actually bear more resemblance to the pagan practices. So what we have here is sort of a blending of the two, or the two of them coming together at that date.
How did those, so you're saying that those two coincidentally merged together because of the dynamics of a Christian tradition on the one hand and a pagan on the other, and the pagan being more Celtic in its nature?
Right. And actually, there may be a sort of direct connection here. I mentioned that the church in Italy, the early church, practiced All Saints' Day in May. It was right around the Feast of Lemuria, which was associated with the dead. Then, well, again, what are you talking about in All Saints? You're talking about people who have departed. They are either in heaven or they're in purgatory. It's about people who are dead, at least in terms of this world. When they shifted to November 1st, they shifted to November 1st following the practice of the Irish Church, which again set the commemoration for the faithful departed at Samhain. So there is a connection in terms of the date. It is intriguing to me that, in both cases you have in the pagan world, you have this association with the dead, and then the Christian holiday for the faithful departed gets attached to that date.
But we're a long way now Glenn, from this kind of thing here in 21st century America. I mean, for many people, Halloween is costumes, it's dressing up as vampires or dressing up even as Spider-Man for that matter, going to Walmart, buying, things and decorating your house and so forth. But still, so you're having some Christian traditions embrace it, celebrate, take their children out. Some see it as a problem. How do we then take this? There's a depth of history here, but you jump over into our time, and it's almost like history is trivialized. Either some people say, well, you look at that, therefore we should have nothing to do. It's a pagan mixture, and it would be a wrong for a Christian. Or people say, oh, it's just a tradition. It's harmless. It means nothing. We just adopt the past and co-opt it for the present. How do you instruct Christians? Where do you help or offer guidance in themes like this?
Yeah, well, in the medieval church, as I said, All Hallowtide was a major holiday. We've completely lost that. I know very few churches who do anything to commemorate even All Saints' Day anymore. You'll have one hymn at the nearest Sunday where you'll sing for all the saints, and that's about all you do. So we've actually lost the Christian element that was at the root of the holiday, and we picked up ideas that really came more from Samhain, frankly, in terms of how we celebrate it. Chris, Halloween is actually, as of the last time I checked, the holiday in which we spent the second most money for celebration. Christmas is first, Halloween is second. And Halloween may be catching up, although if you take into account gifts, maybe not. So what we're seeing in Halloween now is it's sort of a traditional thing. It's a celebration of all things spooky, is the way, I would describe it, but not necessarily spooky. As you say, you see kids going around dressed up as Spider-Man or whatever. They're just dressed up in costumes of whatever looks interesting. I think the adults, though, are much more connected to the spookiness. I see houses in the area that have these 10 or 15 foot skeletons in front of the house. Things like that. The adults really, I think they're much more into the spooky. The kids are much more into the dress up.
I think that sounds about right. Yeah.
So what's going on here? Well, I want to go back to some of the things we said at the vampire show. What I think we're seeing here is, on one level, it's just, let's get into the spirit of the day. We'll put up all of these things. We've got the Mexican Day of the Dead ties into this for some people and so on. But why are people attracted to that? Why does this appeal to them? I don't think anybody is really scared by Halloween decorations. It's not the appeal of the horror movie where you get a rush out of the adrenaline surge. So what's going on? I suspect it has to do with the fact that we're in a world that hides from death.
Mm.
This is in a very real way, almost whistling past the graveyard.
Right.
We do these things as a way of mocking death. It's not really a reminder of death. It's, I think, a way of mocking it and showing, we're not really afraid of this. I ain't afraid of no ghosts. Right. And I don't know that people are consciously thinking about this, but as I look at it, that's what it suggests to me. People are pulling out all these spooky things as a way of, well, if not laughing at death, as a way of sort of controlling it. We recognize the skeletons and the ghosts and the ghouls and all of that on Halloween, and then we put the decorations away and can forget about it for the rest of the year.
Do you think, Glenn, with, in the last couple of years, particularly with the pandemic and, again, the way that we're again back at a kind of a scientific impasse, because here we are with all our modern culture, our technology, our systems, and we were brought to a stop, not only a stop, but to a sobering reality, because everybody had relatives, friends, or someone who was either experiencing COVID, and many who saw deaths from COVID. And certainly we knew it around the world. Do you think some of this, again, the awareness that modern technology and science is not sufficient to answer the depth of the human condition? Is that, you think, fueling more of a reaction of the search again for answers but Christianity is for some past its sell-by date or not considered as being part of the equation.
Yeah, I think that that would be a good explanation for the general increase in interest in various forms of neo-paganism or other supernatural kinds of things. I think that, that's a good explanation for that. I'm not sure it really works as well for Halloween itself, but I think that there's no question that that is one of the things that's going on culturally right now. That we're recognizing the bankruptcy of well, a materialistic vision of the world. It doesn't really provide any meaning. It doesn't provide any purpose. It doesn't provide any real answers for fundamental questions like, I know someday I am going to die. What does that mean?
So, Ken, you know, when you're dealing with, I mean, we've all been at this for a long time as Christians. What would you say if a pastor or a leader came and said, "Look, there are people in my congregation having struggles with Halloween and what to do"? What kind of counsel would you offer
It's a
to a
difficult
church?
thing because you're celebrating darkness. Effectively, you're dealing with the content that you're pursuing. What is the symbolic import of this? So, am I celebrating the forces of darkness and malevolence and evil, or am I just not having a sense of humor? Am I overreacting and not having fun at almost a kind of a cultural laughter at death, as if it was a kind of a thrill of being able to laugh it away as a vehicle of responding to it. There's also the drawing to the terror, the idea of terror and so forth. It's very cognate with that whole dealing with the symbols of Halloween. So the question is going to be, how do you convey this? Because it's a question of what does it mean to the people themselves. And my own view, it would be that I'd be concerned about the celebration of those things that are not beautiful, but that are in fact inimical to the beauty of the gospel and the beauty of goodness and truth. So there's a challenge of what am I celebrating or having fun with or anticipating there. So that's a hard call because I don't want to appear to be overweening.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Glenn? Celebrating the
Yeah.
darkness versus, trying to engage with the dark questions.
Yeah, I think that the way I would approach this, I'm not a pastor, but if I were asked on how to approach this, I would suggest that what we could do is encourage our parishioners to turn away from Samhain and back toward All Hallowtide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a better thing of dispensing error by replacing with truth.
Right. Because, I mean, a lot of Protestant churches will celebrate Reformation Day because Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg on October 31st. And so if you do Reformation Day, you could put a focus on that. But even if you don't do Reformation Day, the point of All Hallowtide is to remember the saints and the people who have gone before us. So this is a great time to celebrate heroes of the faith, to take time, for example, to learn about the stories of some of these people. And there are a lot of really good stories.
No, I think so, and I think it's just striking me because I guess coming from Scottish secular Scotland and the sort of anti-Catholicism that was often a part of the culture I grew up in, I know anything that smacked of Christian, of tradition, or these kind of things was almost just poo-pooed and laughed at. And yet, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of Hebrews chapter 11 and the chapter of the faith in those who have gone, and then the great biographies of Christians that we love to hear of those who, like Wilberforce or either, people older than that, obviously all through the ages that we could be looking at. And here's an opportunity to talk about lives well lived and those who have completed the race. And in that Hebrews 11 picture, they've ascended, they're with the Father, and, they're spurring us on to run our race now, right?
Right. Yeah. And so I think that the reason I started with All Hallowtide is that really that is the root even of our word Halloween, and we've forgotten it. And there is a lot of benefit that we can get from studying history and studying the lives of these great men. There's a lot of inspiration, men and women. There's a lot of inspiration that we can get as we're running our own race by looking to those who have run before us. And given the traditional role of All Hallowtide, this is a great time to spend learning about that and talking about it and celebrating that. So I think that there's a way that we can redeem Halloween, to bring it back to its really original purpose and to turn it away from a celebration of darkness to a celebration of light.
Which is very much like a picture of the resurrection story, isn't it? I mean, that we don't just focus on the death and suffering, although that is the means of the atonement, but the resurrection, that you put those together, that death is not an end in itself. Death, or the death of Christ particularly, brings us to new life. And maybe as Christians, sometimes if we give ground to concentrate only on the negatives, or we give up our own narrative, then you let someone else populate the narrative and take control of that agenda and drive the popular imagination, because we've got nothing to say, or we've just given up on saying things that need to be said.
Yes, I think that that's exactly right. And frankly, we are in a situation where the culture is moving rapidly away from Christian truth. It is pretty far away, and it's going faster and faster away from it. It's a losing proposition, frankly, to say, no, we're not going to participate. We would be in a much better position if we would say, I'm not going to celebrate Halloween the way you guys do it, but there is still something here to celebrate. And it's anchored very deeply in Christian history. And we're going to go with it that way. You can't just keep saying no. You can't replace something with nothing.
No, you have to replace it with a better good again, and
right.
About what you love, rather what you're trying to avert or avoid. Yeah, so it certainly seems to be a biblical truth that replaces the darkness with the light.
So is it fair to say then that in one sense, the true, looking back to the actual historical setting, the idea, the focus was much more on that death had been conquered, and that there was the new life, the resurrection of the dead was more in sight, the eternal life, the hope of heaven, the completion of the race, that was really the access point that was bringing an answer, a hope, a voice into then times, but which needs to perhaps be recaptured, reinvigorated, and better articulated for our moment. Is it something like that, Glenn?
Well, yeah, exactly. Again, the ancient world was held captive by fear of death. And the Christians came in and said, you know what? We don't have to be afraid of this anymore, because Jesus rose from the dead, and we have the promise of the resurrection ourselves. So we don't need to fear death. We can go to martyrdom freely and not worry about it. We can go minister to the sick, and if we get sick and die, so much the better. It's just another form of martyrdom. It gets us to heaven. They acted, the accounts that we have say that the Christians acted with utter contempt for death, utter fearlessness in the face of death, because they believed they would go on to a better world if they died.
And that raises a very interesting line of questions, Glenn and Stuart. And I think it relates to this question of the season itself. When the question of Halloween, what do you think is being celebrated? You could even ask a question of another person. Mm-hmm. And what do you think is being celebrated? And why is this matter of death such a riveting topic? And why do we have this fear of death? In other words, by asking people the question, you're actually leading them into a conscious sense of need for a solution that this is obviously symbolically addressing, but that we have not found one. That's where the good news comes.
Yes,
in.
I think, and I think I would love to a future day have you and Glenn on, because when Glenn said the phrase there, what sparked my mind was that he said about being captive to death. I think our current culture is captive to meaninglessness. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a pervasive sense, not just of death, but of boredom and fear, that life might be completely purposeless and that we're heading towards the oblivion and extinction, and there's a nihilism. And that sense that what these moments do, our hunger for narrative, our hunger for connection, our hunger for a drama, our hunger for a story, a real story that explains, but not doesn't just explain, it anchors us. We fit in. And so all of our encounters of life, sorrow, suffering, death, life, darkness, all of that is answered. There is a narrative that integrates us. I think this is a great opportunity for us, again, as it always is, to really re-articulate the gospel in our time, to connect it to this crying need for hope, direction, power, and purpose.
Yeah, we all have the same fundamental needs. And in a world of mortality, we need to sometimes just ask ourselves questions that are often just overlooked. And this at least provides a trigger, an opportunity to say, why is this? What's the draw? What's the obsession or the interest in this matter of the dark forces or death and so forth? And just asking questions, I think, forces people to think things through on a deeper level than they otherwise would.
Well, I understand, Glenn, you've got an article coming out that we should all be reading. Is that right?
Yeah, I have an article on the history of Halloween, so that we'll get that to you. I want to make one other observation, though, Stuart. The people that I talk to, they're more afraid of life than they are of death. Because if you talk to them about what their fears are, death may show up somewhere down the list, but it's really not what's on their mind. That's something relatively new historically. They're more worried about the economy. They're worried about their standard of living. They're worried about whether they're going to have their job. They're worried about those kinds of things. Most of them, death is going to be fairly far down on the list of what they're worried about, which is a curious thing because death is the one thing that they are all certainly going to face. But that again is part of this. That's part of this denial of death that we see in the culture, hiding it, making believe it doesn't happen, and denying it.
But that would also lend itself to a good conversation about the nature of success and what a good life looks like,
Sure.
And how we shape that. And I think that's something we really do. These topics push us into that, answering the big questions of existence. How should we then live? Why do we live? Where's our motivation? So I'm very, very grateful. And even this helpful historical journey there is going to be important, Glenn. We will certainly be looking for that as the article comes out. And I know we'll be putting it on the Reflections website so that the viewers or our listeners can go and have a look at your article and do a deeper dive into that.
Because we all agree with this, Glenn, that the issues of life are so substantive and fundamental, but they need to be addressed with an eternal perspective in this temporal arena. Otherwise, we'll miss out on the very purpose of the matters of life and death on both ends. So we welcome this discussion, and I think it'd be a worthwhile endeavor to pursue that again. What do people pursue? What do they long for?
Ken, there's an interesting contrast you can make between what I think is the current attitude toward death, which is, yeah, it's something that's going to happen sometime, but I'm not going to think about it. We'll just sort of push it away and so on. And the early church, because the early church said, I don't care about death. Doesn't matter to me. It's in some sense, it's a similar sort of reaction. I'm going to live my life the way I'm going to live it. When death comes for me, so much the better. Except here, there's a denial of really the inevitability of it, and people don't take it as seriously because, again, it's hidden. Whereas in the early church, they acted without regard to death as well, but they did it because they had that eternal perspective and that eternal hope. In our culture, we sort of ignore death and make believe it's not there because we don't know what to do with it. And we are so focused on the temporal that we don't even want to think about it. We push it off that way.
Yeah, push all the ugly stuff out of sight just so we can live the party, have a happy life, a convenient life, and an easy life. Don't have discussions about ugly, dark things. We push them off so we don't have to deal with them, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, we will be back to you on this and other topics. It looks like we've got a range that we want to explore, but we're very grateful for the research you do, the work that you're doing. And I know that on the Reflections website in the coming days, we want to put a lot more of your material so that people can see what you've written and what you will be writing in the days ahead. So thanks for your contribution. We're very grateful for you.
Thank you, Glenn. God bless you.
Thank you.
And to you, Dr. Boa, very good day.
A good day indeed, especially in light of that day.
Amen.
Living 2 days on my calendar.
That's it.
That is the way of living. And then doing that, then we have the best of both worlds.
Amen. Maranatha, come Lord Jesus.
Lord, even so, come quickly.
Amen.